Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going way back to March of 1776.
Oh yeah, 1776.
Pretty pivotal year in general.
Yeah.
But we're going to be looking at something that may not be very familiar to a lot of people.
Right.
It's known as the Battle of the Rice Boats.
Battle of the Rice Boats, yeah.
And you've got some really fascinating material on this. So we're going to kind of unpack this together and figure out just exactly what happened, where it happened, why it was significant, and maybe some of the little details that people may not be aware of.
Yeah, it's a great little story. Fits in with a lot of the bigger picture of the revolution.
Sure.
But it's got its own interesting kind of quirks to it.
Absolutely.
And we've got some good sources to work with. There are a few historical accounts that detail the events really well, the forces involved on both sides, and the final outcome. And for you, the listener, I think what we want to try to do is bring to light a really pivotal moment in early Georgia's involvement in the Revolutionary War. It's a story where local political tensions and basic needs for food and things like that just kind of all collide.
Yeah. So to set the scene for everybody, we are, like I said, in early 1776. It's just about a year after the initial skirmishes at Lexington and Concord.
Right.
Up north, the siege of Boston is in full swing. And that situation, as we know, really put a strain on the British Army's ability to get provisions.
For sure. It was a tough spot for them to be in.
Yeah. And Georgia's position at this time is a little bit unique. Compared to some of those more activist northern colonies, there was a much stronger pull towards neutrality in Georgia.
Right.
But the radical Patriot movement was definitely gaining traction. And it was, slowly stripping Royal Governor James Wright of his authority.
Yeah.
And a pretty clear sign of this is the interception of Governor Wright's plea for naval support.
Yeah, that's a huge turning point.
That really shows just how much power the Patriots were starting to exercise at this point, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. They're monitoring and interfering with these established channels that the British were using to try to stay in control.
Right. So what was the event that really kicked off this Battle of the Rice Boats?
Well, it all started when British warships appeared off the coast of Tybee Island in January of 76. Initially, Governor Wright and I guess many others who were still loyal to the crown thought this was a punitive measure. They thought they were coming to crack down on the rebellion.
Right. They figured it was coming.
Yeah, but that wasn't actually the primary reason they were there. The real goal, as ordered by General Howe, was a lot more basic.
Okay.
They were there to acquire rice and other provisions in Savannah
Ah.
and to resupply those beleaguered troops up in Boston. Eventually, there was a pretty sizable fleet that gathered, ships like the HMS Cherokee, the HMS Siren, HMS Raven, the Tamar, Scarborough, and Hinchinbrook, along with transports like the Whitby and the Symmetry,
Wow.
carrying, probably about 200 British regulars.
Okay, so that's a pretty significant deployment, at least on paper. Now, this arrival obviously really ratcheted up tensions, and it led directly to Governor Wright's his exit, didn't it?
It did. The appearance of those ships in January, that was enough for the Georgia Committee of Safety to actually order the arrest of Governor Wright along with some other Crown officials. And this happened on January 18th.
Okay.
And it was Major Joseph Habersham of the Georgia Militia. He put Wright under house arrest and even made him promise not to try to contact the British ships.
Oh, wow.
But Wright didn't stay put for very long, did he? I remember reading that he was increasingly feeling unsafe and was even harassed while under house arrest.
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine the position he was in. Things were getting pretty rough.
Exactly, yeah. So, despite being under house arrest, he manages to escape on the night of February 11th.
Wow.
He seeks refuge with loyalists, and eventually he's able to get to the HMS Scarborough. And that's really a key moment because it marks the end of British control in Georgia, at least for a while.
Right. It's the end of an era. Now, a Patriot government in Georgia, they weren't just sitting around either, were they?
Oh, no, they were not.
What kind of actions were they taking at this point?
Well, the Georgia Provincial Assembly really starts stepping up its activities. They elect delegates to the Second Continental Congress, and they also start the process of raising regiments for the Continental Army.
So even as the British fleet is out there, they're really solidifying their own power structure.
Yeah.
Okay. So with Wright on a British ship and the Patriots in control on land, you've got this stalemate. Wright tries to secure assurances and supplies from the Patriots.
Right.
But it goes nowhere. What's the main reason for that breakdown?
Well, the biggest hurdle was the Continental Association,
Right.
which Georgia and all 12 colonies had adopted in 1774.
Right.
And that basically was a boycott of all trade with Great Britain.
Okay.
So even if there were some in Georgia who wanted to help or who would have been willing to provide supplies, they couldn't really go against that agreement.
Right.
So any kind of meaningful negotiation was pretty much dead in the water.
Gotcha. Okay. So that leads Captain Andrew Barclay to issue the order for his fleet to move on February 29th. What was his strategic goal at this point?
Barclay's objective was pretty simple. There were merchant ships at Savannah, and the owners were eager to move their goods, especially with trade restrictions set to expire the next day on March 1st.
Oh.
His aim was to seize those ships and their cargo, especially rice, to get those supplies up to Boston.
Okay. So the stage is now set for a confrontation. Tell us about how the Battle of the Rice Boats actually unfolded, starting around March 1st.
All right, so on March 1st, you have several British warships. The Scarborough, the Tamar, the Cherokee, and the Hinchinbrook. They sail up the Savannah River to this place called Five Fathom Hole. They're accompanied by transports carrying British regulars under Major James Grant.
Okay.
The Hinchinbrook and one transport go up the Back River, a separate channel.
Okay, and that's where they run into a little trouble.
Oh yeah, a bit of trouble. The transport anchor's fine, but the Hinchinbrook, trying to maneuver to a strategic position above the town, runs aground on a sandbank.
Oh, no.
Habersham's militia, they're watching, and they seize the opportunity. They open fire on the stranded ship, basically clearing its decks.
Oh, wow.
But they didn't have the boats to actually board and capture it. The Hinchinbrook, luckily for them, manages to float free with the next high tide.
Phew, a close call for the British there.
Yeah.
But they weren't deterred, were they? What did they do next?
Well, on the evening of March 2nd, Major Grant's troops land on Hutchinson Island. That sits across the river from the town of Savannah.
Okay.
They move across the island, and by early morning, March 3rd, about 4 a.m., they capture a number of rice boats anchored near the island. And the surprising thing is, they did it so quietly that no one in Savannah knew about it until about 9:00 a.m.
Wow, that's a big delay. By the time the Patriot forces are aware of what's happening, the British have already secured some of those supplies that they came for. So what was the reaction?
Well, as soon as the alarm was raised, Colonel Lachlan McIntosh springs into action.
Okay.
He gathers around 300 militiamen, and he sets up 3 4-pound cannons on Yamacraw Bluff, which has a great view of the river.
Okay.
He sends a couple envoys under a flag of truce to one of the occupied ships, but they were immediately arrested by the British.
Oh, so much for diplomacy.
Not a great start, yeah. So a second, larger group is sent to negotiate. They want the release of those captured envoys, and they want the British to hand over the seized ships.
Okay.
It's during this parley that things go really south. The leader of the Patriot group, Captain Rogers, is apparently insulted, and he fires his pistol at someone on the ship.
Things escalated pretty quickly.
Yeah. The
Hmm.
British fire back, wounding one of the Patriots and almost sinking their boat.
Wow, diplomacy just completely collapses.
It does. So after that chaotic retreat of the parley, McIntosh has no choice but to order his militia to fire those cannons from Yamacraw Bluff, and that's the start of a 4-hour gun battle.
A 4-hour gun battle. That's intense.
Yeah, it was a pretty significant exchange, but the cannons weren't the only thing the Patriots used. They also employed burning ships.
Right, that was a pretty audacious tactic, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. The Committee of Safety, while they're meeting, decide to burn the remaining supply ships in the harbor. They don't want the British to get their hands on them.
Right.
And so a militia company is given this dangerous task.
Okay.
One ship, the Inverness, is set on fire and sent drifting towards those British-occupied ships.
A real fire ship. That's a pretty bold move. What was the impact of that?
It causes complete chaos among the British. They have to abandon those seized vessels to avoid the flames. And during that confusion, the American militia, along with the battery on the bluff, are keeping up their attacks, firing muskets and grape shot.
So how did the ships end up after all that?
Of the ships the British had taken, 2 escaped downstream and 2 more actually sail upstream to avoid the fire. But they're eventually forced to dock and their crews are captured by the Patriots. 3 of the supply ships are destroyed by the fire, and they burn well into the night.
Wow.
The Patriots also get some much-needed reinforcements. 500 South Carolina militia arrive. They had been requested earlier, just in case something like this happened.
Okay, so it's a pretty mixed outcome for the British in terms of getting those supplies. What happens in the aftermath of the battle?
Well, the following day, McIntosh sends another delegation to Captain Barclay. This time, they're proposing a prisoner exchange. Barclay refuses.
He refuses.
Yeah. So the Georgia Committee of Safety, They order the arrest of the remaining members of Governor Wright's council who are still in Savannah.
Okay.
It's a smart move, it works, and the British eventually release the prisoners in exchange for promises of protection for those council members.
It sounds like both sides were playing a pretty strategic game even after the fighting was over.
Mm.
What about those merchant ships the British initially wanted to seize? Did they get them out of the harbor?
Yeah, they did. They managed to sail most of those ships down the back river. The channel was shallow in spots, though, so some ships had to dump some of their cargo, including rice, to keep from running aground.
Oh, that's got to be frustrating.
Yeah. But once they reached Tybee Island, they loaded up about 1,600 barrels of rice onto those two transport ships.
So they got something, but definitely not without a fight.
Yeah.
What happened to the British fleet after that?
They stay anchored off Tybee Island for a bit while they're negotiating that prisoner exchange. They also capture several other ships that sailed into the area, taking them as prizes of war.
Okay.
Then, on March 25th, the Savannah militia burned all the houses on Tybee Island to prevent Wright and the British officers from using them as a base.
Wow, that's pretty extreme.
Yeah. Finally, on March 30th, Captain Barclay set sail north with a convoy of merchant ships and transports.
And their destination at this point wasn't Savannah or even Boston anymore, was it?
No, it wasn't. They had evacuated Boston earlier that month, so Barclay initially heads for Newport, Rhode Island.
Okay.
But the Patriots there, they weren't too happy to see him. They even fire on his ships, denying him any kind of help or supplies. He eventually rejoins the main British force at Halifax, Nova Scotia in May.
It was a long and not very successful supply run for the British.
Yeah, it didn't really work out for them.
Okay. So looking back, what's the significance of this Battle of the Rice Boats and Governor Wright's departure from Georgia?
Well, the battle and Wright's escape, they mark the end of British control over the colony. They don't really regain control until they retake Savannah in December of 1778. Wright comes back to rule from 1779 to 82, but this period in 76 really solidified Patriot control in Georgia.
Okay.
And it shows their commitment to the revolution. And this rice, by the way, was really important for Howe's forces.
Right, they were in a tough spot.
Yeah, their supply lines were really contested on land. Denying them the rice put a huge strain on them. It showed that the Patriots were willing to mess with British logistics, even in a relatively neutral colony like Georgia.
Absolutely. And what about casualties? How did the two sides fare?
The casualties were actually pretty light compared to some of the bigger battles that would come later. The Patriots only had one man wounded and the loss of that fire ship.
Okay.
British casualties aren't known exactly, but it's thought that a couple of their warships were damaged. They lost 3 supply ships that were sunk and 3 more were captured.
Okay, so to wrap up, what are the big takeaways from this Battle of the Rice Boats?
The Battle of the Rice Boats, while maybe not as famous as some other early Revolutionary War battles, represents a really key instance of Patriot resistance in Georgia.
Yep.
It was all about preventing those vital supplies, especially the rice, from getting to the British forces that were bottled up in Boston. And it played a huge role in solidifying Patriot control in Georgia by getting rid of the royal governor. It really shows that complex mix of local politics, economics, and that growing revolutionary fervor that was spreading throughout the colonies.
It's amazing to think how all these localized events, often sparked by specific circumstances, contributed to the momentum of the American Revolution. It makes you wonder, what would have happened if the British had actually got those rice supplies without a fight? And how did this small engagement shape Georgia's path in the war? It's a lot to think about. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive with you.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.